Hello. Isn't this exciting? Are we excited? I'm extremely excited. I'm Josh Zepps. I have a podcast called We the People Live, where I interview strange people like Sam Harris and Bret Weinstein and Joe Rogan and Dave Rubin and such folk, who I'm sure are names familiar to some of you. You may also have heard me on ABC Local Radio, and I have a show on Radio National called The People Versus, which you can also podcast, which is also interesting. But tonight is not about me. Tonight is about 5 unique and interesting and fascinating people, all of whom have different specialties and all of whom are interesting in varied ways, who are trying to have conversations that bust out of the normal forums and the normal ways of thinking about things and don't fall neatly along partisan political lines. So without further ado, please welcome to the stage Eric and Bret Weinstein, Sam Harris, Maajid Nawaz, and Douglas Murray.
I got you a drink.
Now, I think that, how many of you know all of these people? Yeah. You're not expected to know everything about all of them, so just as a general rule of thumb so that you don't get disoriented, especially for people who are listening to the audio version of this who can't actually see the difference between each of them. Eric Weinstein is a physicist genius who manages Teal Capital, which is an investment firm. Douglas Murray is the associate editor of The Spectator magazine in the UK. Maajid Nawaz runs Quilliam, which is a foundation that tries to spread counter narratives to Islamist ones. Sam Harris, of course, a neuroscientist, philosopher, podcaster, writer extraordinaire. And Bret Weinstein is Eric's brother, who's an evolutionary biologist and has a lot of interesting insights into why we do the things that we do. And he was involved in a major scandal last year where he refused to participate in a day of absence that Evergreen State College, where he was a professor, tried to impose on him. So that's just the general snapshot. And what we wanted to talk about tonight specifically is what really matters. That's the rather esoteric and mildly pretentious title of this evening's session. And what does really matter, we probably all agree, is the Enlightenment and reason and rationality and avoiding chaos and hysteria and unreason. And so what we wanted to do here is just start by talking about why does this even need defending? Why in 2018 are we losing the narrative fight, seemingly, both globally and increasingly in Western democracies, with the rise of the far-right parties, Brexit, Trump? So to begin that conversation, maybe the easiest way to start is, Maajid, you're the only one amongst us who spent a large portion of your life not believing in Enlightenment values. Why?
So in a sense, I think, hi everyone. In a sense, I think you're asking me to steel man the case for Islamism.
Yes.
So that we know what the weak points are to...
Maajid, your mic looks slightly off. Is that here a little bit?
Is that better?
Quiet?
Okay, yeah, all right. So, okay, hello everyone, start again. In a sense, Josh, I think what I'm hearing you do is ask me to steel man Islamism so that we know where the weaknesses are for Western Enlightenment values, so we know what we have to defend because we, by me steel manning Islamism, know what's coming under attack. And that would be, I suppose, the purpose of this exercise. So I will steel man Islamism with the caveat that everyone understands here, that I haven't decided to renege on my...
And just for people who aren't up with the jargon, just remind them what...
Get a video of you.
This is,
just remind people what steel manning means.
Right, so the best way to build, to respond to your adversary's case is to actually respond to what they are saying rather than respond to what you are imputing that they are saying. If you impute that somebody is saying something they are not, it's called a straw man. And of course, you find yourself not responding to their actual point, much to their frustration. And it's much healthier for conversation, but also if you want to change somebody's mind, that you respond to what they are actually saying. And so to build an argument for what somebody's actually saying is called to steel man, and in a sense it's the opposite of a straw man. As I said, that's imputing something to somebody when they're not actually saying that. So I will steel man Islamism for the panel. And I suppose we can go from there, because then we know something. We know, all of us here, obviously, by definition, are concerned about building a case for the defense, but beyond defense, I suppose, the propagation of Western Enlightenment values. I put the word Western in quotation marks for reasons we may want to come to later, but Enlightenment values, essentially. And because they are the best that we've got at the moment, and they're the best of a bad bunch of ideas. I think Bret will come in at some stage to talk about why there's some weaknesses there, but we need to know where they're being attacked, and we need to know where the blind spots are. So let me start with this. If you look at the notion that we in the West genuinely and sincerely, as societies, but especially as governments, care for liberal, secular, democratic values, that is actually quite easy to attack. I could actually still do it today. Because let's start with our foreign policy, and it's quite easy to see where, depending on where our economic interests may lie, that we will, in some instances, proactively support dictatorships abroad, and in other instances, proactively undermine democratic countries, if they happen not to align with our economic interests, or indeed toe the foreign policy line that we want to take. And there are clear historic examples of that, but the contemporary examples, that kind of stand out for us are especially countries like Saudi Arabia, where we've had historical alliances and relationships with absolute, total dictatorships. Now, the only region in the world where an absolute monarchy still reigns, and when I mean an absolute monarchy, I mean that the king can literally decide whether you live or die on a whim, is the Gulf, it's the Middle East. And they are, whether it's Saudi Arabia or whether it's other Gulf monarchies, they are reigning supreme. And so the line that the argument or the notion that we sincerely as societies and as the state care for the advocacy of democratic values falls apart, especially when not that we're dealing with these countries on a pragmatic basis, but when we have a relationship with them where we share in their advocacy of their medieval culture. And so that may change now in 2018, but certainly from the invasion of Afghanistan onwards, we've had a very unhealthy relationship with Saudi Arabia where we have subsidized the proselytization of a certain type of Saudi foreign policy. And so the Islamist argument would be that in terms of foreign policy, of course, the interest for freedom and democracy and secularism collapses the minute economic interest comes to play, and that's, in essence, the critique of capitalism. But it's not just in foreign policy when it comes to supporting dictators, and especially in the Cold War, we saw this with the US government sponsoring coups in certain countries, sponsoring the invasion of certain countries, the Bay of Pigs and the whole Iran-Contra affair, sponsoring the assassination of certain leaders abroad because they were in the wrong political camp. They happened to be in the Soviet camp, and of course that the US would undermine, even where people have elected them by the popular vote, the US would, in its foreign policy, actively undermine those popularly elected governments because they didn't align with the Western sphere of influence, but rather they fell in the Soviet sphere of influence. And so Islamists seize upon this when seeking to recruit Muslims to say that their advocacy for Western secular democratic values is insincere. But it becomes even more potent when you talk about it in the case of invasion of countries, right? So here you have President George Bush, who wants to, who in the name of freedom and democracy wants to spread that and decides the best way to spread freedom and democracy is by military occupation. And so, it's often sometimes the obvious is staring at us in the face, but because we're not subject to the consequences of that obvious, it isn't as important a point for us. But I can guarantee you that the case for freedom and democracy in the Middle East was dealt a serious and severe and literally violent blow by the invasion of Iraq. And there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before its invasion. There certainly was no ISIS before there was before the invasion of Iraq by Tony Blair and George Bush. So there is also the sort of that element of occupying countries that we don't like. The 9/11 attacks were planned in Afghanistan. Iraq had nothing to do with it. Moving to domestic policies, of course, again, the Islamists will make a case that power is the most important thing, not values. And so when that power is threatened, the first thing to be compromised are those values. So now if I were to list cases of the civil liberties violations since the war on terror, we've pretty much lost everything. And that makes the Islamist case for us, that the Western governments don't actually care for.
What do you mean that we've lost everything?
Right, so let's start with the right to liberty. So if you're going to build a human rights case up for 48 days detention without trial, which is where the UK was before David Cameron, a Conservative Prime Minister, reversed a Labour government's decision to hold a suspect for 48 days without trial. They introduced the Terrorism Act 2000, Schedule 7, which took away the right to silence under interrogation, and it became a criminal offence not to answer the police's questions if you're held at any port of entry and exit in the UK under the Terrorism Act 2000. So the right to silence, which people, what they call the Miranda rights, which people cherish, it's been removed. It's been removed, and Lawrence Southern was held
at
under
airports.
this. At any port of entry or exit in the UK, right? And of course, it all begins from that, right? So the extradition, for example, rendition.
I'm getting I'm confused about one thing, though.
Yep.
All of these.
I'm still in role play, by the way.
Yeah, no, I know, I got that. Yeah, but it seems like all of these erosions of our commitment to Western tolerance and our Enlightenment values are in the direction of values that Islamists would endorse.
Precisely.
Right? So like Islamists are not concerned about democracy and the maintenance of civil liberties.
But that's their point. They are trying to, very, very openly and frankly, candidly, trying to build societies that are hierarchical. And when we offer a response to that and say, well, we don't need that because we've got societies that are free and open and we don't want societies that are hierarchical, their argument would be you're living in an illusion.
So it's hypocrisy. The charge is hypocrisy.
More than that there is no such thing as an open society. And so if you're going to choose between hierarchical societies, if you're going to have a man that's going to tell you what to do or God tell you what to do, that's their kind of logic, right? But they're both hierarchical and opaque societies. So moving beyond Schedule 7, talk about rendition to torture, right? So the UK has directly been involved and has actually been involved in payouts to jihadist sympathizers like Mozen Beg. They paid him money because he went to prosecute the UK government for being involved in his interrogation and torture in Bagram in Afghanistan. Whether it's him or the Libyan case that recently came out, the UK has been involved in the rendition to third countries with the cooperation of regimes that torture suspects that the UK has then profited from in terms of receiving intelligence that has been acquired through torture. And yet here we are that, our critique of jihadists and Islamists is they don't respect human rights. But our governments have been, and this part is true, right? They have been involved in serious human rights violations. And so whether it's rendition to third countries or indeed detention without trial, data and spying and the Snoopers Charter, what it's called in the UK, or even the NSA spying stuff, the Islamists will generally argue that everything that we are defending doesn't actually exist. It's an illusion. And I'll finish by reading something, because in my autobiography, there's a little excerpt that I called The Polemic, and it was me attempting to remind everybody precisely what we're up against in terms of propaganda against Western Enlightenment values. And what I think we learn from this is that if we understand what those weaknesses are, it's why it's so important to defend those values where they are being eroded, because we recognize we're handing propaganda coups to those who want to destroy everything that these values stand for. But also B, we actually see where the attack's coming from, and we're better prepared to counterattack as well. So this is chapter 16 from my book. It's called The Polemic. It says, again, this is, by the way, this is me in character, right? So please don't get scared, right? You drop bombs on my people while knowing full well that the level of collateral damage, we call them innocent Muslims, will far exceed the damage to any legitimate target. For you, killing our children en masse, and you still call it collateral damage, is an unavoidable consequence of pursuing your policies in our lands. To us, they are simply children. Don't you think we've been crying too, like you are now, for years? Do you think we felt no pain as you raped and plundered our lands and bombed our cities? What lands, what cities, you ask? Your arrogance is only compounded by your ignorance. Look to Iraq. In order to remove Saddam Hussein, after the Kuwait War, you killed over 500,000 children because you could. Because you could. And because my people were too lost, too defeated to be able to stop you. These are our children. We cry for them even as you feel absolutely nothing. What of Leslie Stahl's question on 60 Minutes, posed to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright? She said, "We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died at Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?" Albright's callous response is etched in our memories, staining our innocence with her venom. She said, "I think it is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it." And you wonder why we're so angry? You wonder even now why, after all these years, as we speak these words, we are consumed with rage? The price of killing 500,000 children with your depleted uranium bombs is worth pursuing, but woe be to us if we ever strike back. In your world, Albright's interview was barely mentioned. A Dow Jones search of mainstream news sources after the attack turned up only one reference to the interview in an Orange County newspaper. But in our world, in the hell we live in, this is major news. We will not forget our dead just because you have no feelings. Is killing innocent civilians justified only for your own foreign policy interests? You claim that, unlike us, you don't target civilians, that your intentions are noble, that you seek only humane concerns. How many deaths of untargeted civilians by your hands entitles us to respond? 5? 10? 100? 500,000? Are 3,000 deaths enough to make you feel the pain of each and every mother you untargeted with depleted uranium? If not, then know that our intentions in bringing you death can also be noble. We too shroud destruction in humane concerns. You do not have a monopoly on reaping devastation off the back of good intentions. So don't you dare claim such a thing. You can support, fund, and train dictators in our lands who've been torturing our brothers and raping our sisters in their prisons for decades, and yet you invade our countries claiming to bring democracy? And you cite international law at us, while you willfully ignore Israel's occupation of Palestine as defined by the United Nations itself. We will never forget your friendship with Mubarak and Assad, your unconditional support of an occupying Israel, the way you used us as mujahideen in Afghanistan only to turn on us once you got what you wanted. You chose your side and we have chosen ours. We've come to know that no amount of civilized pleading, no amount of appealing to your humanity, for your mercy, no amount of playing by your rules in your game will move you. You are stupefied in ignorant bliss while we bleed and secrete pus from every orifice. There is only one thing you people value and cherish, and that is your own lives, your own happiness, and your own selfish oblivion. If inflicting upon you even an atom's weight of the pain we suffer at your hands wakes you from your stupor and forces you to listen to our cries as we drown, then I'm afraid we have finally decided that though it's a very hard choice, the price we think is worth it.
All right, you've won me over. I'm becoming a jihadist.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll send my bank account details. You can send me the check later on.
I think the wise thing for you to do now would probably be to counter that steel man.
Well, I think everyone else can do that. I've spoken too much.
Sam.
Well, I actually would add to the side of the balance against the Enlightenment in that I think there's more to the case for there's more that explains why we find ourselves in this uncanny position of having to defend Enlightenment values and reason and a scientific worldview against creeping theocracy and just naked tribalism, populism, all these eruptions of seemingly archaic and discredited ideas. And it's far simpler than just exporting our chaos to other countries and dropping bombs where we can find no other way to persuade people to just buy our products or whatever it is we intend. It's just that it's hard to live an unambiguously good life. It's hard to live a profound life. It's hard to live a life that you know each day is working. And it's pretty clear that living a good life entails more than just not being wrong about things scientifically. And it entails more than just having reasonably free markets that produce the next smartphone that you desperately want to buy. And so it's on the problem of what it means to live a good life that these kind of ancient worldviews continue to market themselves as the only game in town. I mean, so religions of all kinds, but there's something uniquely captivating about Islam in this regard, because it really is the whole package in terms of its egalitarianism, it's the kind of the swiftness with which you can be indoctrinated into it, the fact that if you are kind of on the high testosterone side of things, it offers a militant and James Bondian adventure if you want to go and fight for the one true faith. And so it offers meaning in a way that's really, it's just off-the-shelf kind of meaning that you can get. And what we're struggling for, I think, in a secular context is how you can connect people with meaning and purpose and profundity without lying to them or causing them to lie to themselves about the nature of reality or what we have every reason to believe about it. And that's a challenge that we're trying to meet, I think, in piecemeal ways, but I think we're all to some degree or another suffering the lack of a shelf in the bookstore that has no bullshit on it, that does describe a philosophy of life and a way of living that is more than just seeing what's on Netflix every night.
Would that be, are you describing the power of myth?
Yeah, I was just going to say, somewhere in North America, Jordan Peterson is just waking up, bolt upright in bed, going, "What bullshit? There's not bullshit." Sorry he couldn't be here. It's too damn far. Douglas.
Yeah.
It's bloody far. Douglas, the loss of meaning in the West and the loss of a spine amongst Western intellectuals, the loss of a sense that there is something worthy of defending is one of the themes that you come back to a lot.
Sure. I just say at the beginning, I could go through every one of the things that Maajid just listed in that and shoot them down, but that would take a little while. Let me just make one observation about the list, which is the enormous risk that often happens of people absorbing the arguments of opponents who do not wish you well. So, for instance, on interventionism, you never hear, in fact, I've said this to Maajid before, but I've never heard anyone from the Islamic world say, "Thank God for NATO." Yeah. But they should.
But by the way, I'll spend the rest of my book debunking these,
sure.
Just for everyone's,
But I mean, they shouldn't. The reason I mention this is for the selective historical reasons which we in the West are at risk of imbibing. For instance, I say, why does nobody say thank God for NATO? Because if NATO hadn't intervened in Kosovo, I think it's widely agreed that a severe genocide would have occurred on the continent of Europe, worse than was already happening. NATO intervened. We don't expect thank yous endlessly, but once would be something. And
thank you, Douglas.
So I have. It's not enough. But this is just worth remembering, because a generation and a lot of people from a generation are at risk of imbibing basically the jihadists' arguments about us. And I just put that out there at the beginning. The second thing I'd just say quickly is, I mean, the fascinating thing now about looking back at, for instance, intervention in Afghanistan is that, it's one of the great fallacies of history which we're always vulnerable to, which is to think that everyone knew in the past what we know now. And, until the 1980s, the major threat to countries like ours was global communism, the Soviet expansionism. We saw it as a major threat. And anyone who doubts that just has to say that, I mean, if up until I've often thought of this. Until as late as basically the 10th of September 2001, if you said, in the early years of the 21st century, politicians, journalists, public intellectuals, and others are going to spend years talking about Islam. Say, what? Why? How come? It's not that interesting. It's not that vital in our societies. It's a bit of our societies. It's not overwhelming. If you said, okay, you're going to be discussing Islamic blasphemy laws all across Scandinavia for years. Why?
And the jurisprudence of face veils.
Yeah, and like you're going to be the major debate in the UK in August 2018 is going to be the burqa.
Yeah.
How does that happen? I don't see I don't see the way.
That is a bit surreal, isn't it?
So here's the deep underlying thing, which is that religion's back. And most people in the West don't know how to talk about it or think about it. And I've just got this endless concern about this matter because I've had this conversation, as I think a lot of other people here have, for years with politicians and others, and they still don't understand the nature of this. And I just give you one example quickly. A little while ago, I was speaking to a TV producer who came over to me at a party somewhere and said, it was at the height of ISIS, and she said, what do ISIS want, Douglas? And I thought, oh, okay. Well,
They're actually quite upfront about it generally.
yeah, they're quite. They've done a lot of speaking about this and a lot of writing, and they basically want to bring about they invite the world to Islam and bring about the end times. And this woman looked at me and she said, like. She said, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, they can't. I said, what do they really want? And I said, well, they say that they want to invite the world to Islam, or their version of Islam, and then bring about the end of times. And she just looked at it like, I don't see that. I don't. So, and then I realized, well, if I just said to her, basically what ISIS are after is like a 2.5% reduction in VAT, she'd have been all over it. Oh, yeah. Oh, I see. Well, would they settle for 1.2? You know, we'd have been able to talk about it.
It is a bit high, isn't it?
Let's find some compromise. But she had no idea. And that for me, in a nutshell, is one of the things, one of the many things we're walking through at the moment is the inability of people in societies like ours to realize that some of our opponents believe that they have the explanation for everything, the justification for everything, the meaning of everything, now, yesterday, tomorrow, and to the ends of time and eternity. And we say, come again? At the very least, we have to educate ourselves about this. But this is, I don't want to...
Yeah, they're ideologues.
But Bret Weinstein, Douglas just said that we're up against religion. Religion's making a comeback. But in the grand sweeping kind of arc of the challenges that we currently face, it ain't just religion that's the only source of unreason. You have personal experience of another sort of orthodoxy and dogma. Can you expand this conversation from religion specifically to other ways in which groupthink and tribalism are posing a threat to Enlightenment values?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised it. I was sitting here thinking this is amazing that we're talking about why the Enlightenment is on the ropes, and the only thing on the table is the Islamic threat to the Enlightenment, when in fact there's this whole other part of it that in the West is quite live, especially within the academy, where people have begun to feel sophisticated arguing against the mechanisms of the Enlightenment, the scientific method itself, the values of the Enlightenment, and you don't really imagine that people you could imagine that people are a little bit deaf to what those values are and how they work, but it's a little hard to imagine that people would actually explicitly argue against them until you've faced it, and I have faced it. I've brought up the Enlightenment and said these values needed protecting, and I've been told that actually that's the problem. So I think we have to disentangle a couple of things here in order to see what's going on. The Enlightenment, by largely an accident of history, is a European phenomenon. And there are a lot of folks who are looking at the world and noting that it appears to be rigged in a particular way that preserves a kind of power that is resident in Europe and amongst people of European descent elsewhere, like Australia, the US, etc. And they are not phrasing their argument particularly well, nor do I think the argument is very strong, but the argument is something like, you're telling us, the world, that the Enlightenment is the path forward, and it just so happens that you, in the European-derived West, are ahead in the use of these tools, which you claim are the route to discovering the truth of how the universe works. So are you really telling us that it just so happens that the way forward for all of us is a way in which you are all ahead? That sounds like bullshit to us, right? That sounds like you deciding that it just so happens we're going to settle military matters from now on with basketball. Oh, really? Basketball? That's the game you're going to choose to settle it? It's not going to be soccer or something like that? It's going to be basketball? So the thing that I think we have to notice is that there is truth in the part of this that says that, yes, the power that derives from Enlightenment values is not evenly distributed across the globe. But the question is, are we really supposed to reject the power of the Enlightenment, or are we supposed to democratize the power of the Enlightenment? I think democratizing the power of the Enlightenment is a slam dunk. And I would point out, actually, I feel in a good position to say this because although I am of European descent, I'm also Jewish, and the Enlightenment was not a Jewish phenomenon. But I'm going to wield those tools like a broadsword because they're the best tools. They don't come from my ancestors, but they are useful to me, and they will be useful to my descendants. And anybody who wishes to be powerful on Earth by virtue of understanding how things actually function should level up through the acquisition and enhancement of this particular toolkit. So that's really, I think, the battle we're in. Are we supposed to reject the toolkit in order to level the playing field, or are we supposed to bring everybody on board with the toolkit so that everybody has access to these most powerful tools for discovering how things function?
Now, wouldn't the social justice warriors who hounded you out of a job say that they actually are on the side of the Enlightenment, and that the evolution of greater egalitarianism and participation for all people, whatever their gender or race, is a trajectory that they're defending?
I would have thought that that's what they would say, but they literally said the opposite. And it's honestly the most stunning thing to face people who would stare down the Enlightenment and claim that, in fact, it's a kind of fraud, that really the whole idea that the Enlightenment is a key to insight is a rationalization for the naked wielding of power, that it's not really insight at all, that the arguments that are powerful in science are really just power arguments. They're not arguments about truth or mechanism or anything like that. So, yeah, before I had these conversations myself, I would have said exactly what you conjectured. But
I want to
having
confirm
had
that.
them,
They have jumped the shark.
Yeah.
So just recently, about a month ago in the UK, there was a clickbait TV interview between Piers Morgan and somebody whose name I can't remember. But Piers was criticizing her for her support of the hijacking of the left-wing movement in the UK and strawmanned her. Piers Morgan said, well, you know, it was over immigration, and he said, well, your hero, Obama, did so and so and so and so under his presidency. And she responded with these very words. She said, Obama's not my hero. I'm literally a communist, you idiot. Now, what happened next was the clip went viral. People started cheering as if that was a great response, that she shut up Piers Morgan, who is in need of shutting up on many an occasion, but not by proudly announcing you're a communist. Now, that's what's happened, right? So they've jumped the shark. She didn't try and argue a defense of Enlightenment values against his position, and taken a pro-immigration position from an egalitarian perspective. She basically ditched all of that, said she was a communist. What happened next fascinated me even more. There's a magazine, what was it? What's that magazine she was featured in? It was
Teen Vogue.
Some
of you may have missed it.
Or was it Ella? Ella magazine?
No, it's Teen Vogue. I assure you, I bought both.
Right.
It's a fine intellectual quarterly.
Douglas reads them in the sauna. But it said, and it was headlined, you know, something along the lines of, just so I'm not defaming anyone, because of course I just won a great defamation case, 3.4 million, thank you. It was a... It said something along the lines of, hero who shut up Piers Morgan, by quipping that she is literally a communist, as if that was a good thing. And that magazine was printed in D.C. The journalist who wrote it was in Washington, D.C.
The moral frivolity of deciding to forget the Gulag in order to win a point of Piers frigging Morgan is a real disgrace. Anyhow, look, where to... Just one other thought very quickly to back up what Bret just said. I mean, look, there are people on college campuses now in the US, there was one again recently, described facts as European-centric as an idea. They're like, facts are like something we've got to fight against because of where they come from and their oppressive nature.
The funny thing is that the guy who says that the most is the President of the United States, who that person probably doesn't like very much.
Yeah, but they mirror each other in
many
ways.
Eric, you're a scientist. What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, the whole thing's absolutely fascinating. To me, we've reached some point of decadence and exhaustion that we were not expecting. And I think we had thought that the Enlightenment was very well embedded in many of these societies, and we now find that it's sort of like down to a handful of people whose names we can reel off, who are willing to defend it in an environment where every time you stand up to defend this thing, you find yourself in a world of hurt. And we're not exactly up against the intellectual A-team either. So,
can you just unpack what you mean when you say that you stand up to defend it and you find yourself in a world of hurt?
Well, if I say, there was a tweet the other day from Planned Parenthood of Kentucky, which made a very interesting biological observation. I'm not sure if it was peer-reviewed or not, but it said, some men have a uterus 15 times. Some men have a uterus, because apparently things become more true as you perseverate.
It was peer-reviewed in Teen Vogue.
Well, yeah. And I think my response was, either you're referring to persistent Mullerian duct syndrome, in which case this is not how we discuss science, or you're just eating a box of multicolored crayons hoping to shit a rainbow. And I can't tell you how much you know what they meant. So, no, I don't fully know what they mean. I think what you're telling me that they mean is that this would be a really good place to lie about things in a particular way that's kind. And I do think that that's important. There are load-bearing fictions. In America, it's very important, one man, one vote. But why is it that Wyoming has 2 senators and,
2 people.
What?
It's 2 people and 2 senators.
Yeah. Right. So, the whole thing is prima facie insane, right? If you think about it as contract bridge, the Enlightenment gets into trouble by extolling its own virtues, like one man, one vote, and all men are created equal, and then everything is honored in the breach. And so people who get really angry about these sort of hypocrisies get very, very angry. So let's define something called Enlightenment plus. Like, you get the Enlightenment, which is all the good stuff, and then you get like the Dulles brothers and Kermit Roosevelt trying to destabilize Iran, and COINTELPRO in America assassinating Fred Hampton in his bed, and driving Jean Seberg to miscarry and commit suicide just because she was a supporter of radical black rights in the 60s. We've done a lot of bad things, and we've extolled these virtues in a way that many of us find absolutely exhausting. Now, what's interesting to me about Maajid's description is that, and this is something I don't think we've discussed before, but Bret and my family had a spy sent against it in the 1950s by our government. And the response to that is not, okay, well, the Enlightenment's off. This is, we're going to declare a Jewish jihad from the left wing for this patently unethical behavior. Instead, it's this sense of, oh man, I'm going to use the Enlightenment and shove this shit down your throat. I'm going to make you so sick and so upset with yourself that you come to understand the pain that you've inflicted on others for, let's say, the McCarthy era, the Tuskegee medical experiment, or all of these things that are absolutely sickening and disgusting. So the key question...
You just made the point. It's only by reference to the Enlightenment, the values of the Enlightenment, that those violations of the values are problematic and are evidence of hypocrisy.
Well, I think
you're holding yourself to the standard that is being violated, and this is being weaponized against Enlightenment cultures by people who don't share those values. So very, very cynically, I mean, it is analogous to the use of human shields. It's like the people who will use human shields know that the people they're fighting care about so-called collateral damage, and it's an asymmetric moral contest.
Yes, but I would say that when you have 1.6 billion people, you can afford all sorts of exotic strategies like sending suicide bombers. When you're down to your last 20 million or whatever it is that we Jews have, you're thinking like, hey, this Enlightenment looks like some pretty heavy weaponry. We should figure out how to wield it and take it away from the Scots, because I think this is our day, right? So I think it's very important to understand that there's a contract bridge element where you make a bid and then you fall short of the bid, and that embitters and angers people. But what I'm concerned about in this discussion is that somehow we're tired. We're just so exhausted. And you look at Islam, and man, Islam is muscular. Russia looks muscular. China looks muscular.
Well, that's the thing, is that anything looks muscular in the
compare it, clearly. I mean, you have a photo online posted yesterday with your midriff showing. So.
Yeah. Hello, Sydney.
Yeah.
I think there's an important point to make here, which is that I think that there is a danger we have conversations at different paces. I do want to get this point out the way so it's clear that when Douglas and I speak, and it became apparent when you brought the left in, which clearly we have that challenge with Corbyn's Labour Party in the UK as well, but the most pressing challenge we have in Europe is jihadism. And often when we speak, we're speaking to a reality in Europe. There's a lived experience. I walk down the streets especially when ISIS were in power, and I'm sure Douglas does as well, looking over my shoulder in case somebody's going to slit my throat.
I was told not to appear in public for a year by the police.
Yeah. So there's a danger that when we speak, we're speaking to a specific reality, but our words are going around the world, and that is in danger of being misinterpreted as an overemphasis on Islam, right? And so just a quick example. Muslims in America, when surveyed, are more pro-gay marriage than their Christian evangelical counterparts, when surveyed. Muslims in Britain, when surveyed, are 53% in favor of criminalizing being gay. Now, this is the latest survey from 2016, right? And the one from America was from 2017. So when Douglas and I speak, we're speaking to a reality where 53% of my co-religionists want to ban his existence. Whereas in America, they're better than the Christians on that front. So just want to get that point clear, that there are slightly different realities. We're speaking to different emphases.
Crocodiles are nearer different boats.
And it's important to make that point, because when we speak to that specific reality, of course, our words don't stay in that reality. So we look as if we're overly focused on something when actually,
So you also just have to note that there's this weird confluence between these two things, which to this day I can't make much sense of, where the postmodern left, and we can argue whether or not postmodern is the right term, given that most of the people in the category don't know anything about postmodernism. They're just behaving in a postmodern fashion, but that they are embracing and rationalizing Islamic extremism is a very interesting fact. That among the things that they don't understand is the danger of this extreme ideology that's being deployed, that is itself so very intolerant of things like homosexuality. So there is at the core, and if you haven't run into it personally, it's worth having some conversations so that you can actually hear what the thought process sounds like. But this idea that there is no reality, that all arguments, no matter how mechanistic and backed by evidence, are really power in disguise, and therefore you can make any argument, and if it functions in a powerful way, then it's as true as anything else. Therefore, stigmatizing people for things that they're not guilty of is as valid a thing to do as anything else. That concept is very destructive and dangerous, and it is backing both the attack on the Enlightenment within the academy in the West and the rationalizing of extreme elements in Islam, both of which are truly dangerous.
But just trying to loop slightly back. What I was trying to get to about the Enlightenment plus. So all the good stuff of the Enlightenment, plus like the dirty tricks and kind of the, we'll steal some land and take people's resources and lie about some elections and maybe assassinate some people in South America, all that kind of stuff. The whole point is to get rid of as much plus as possible. And I don't think it's possible to get rid of all of the Enlightenment plus stuff that doesn't actually make us feel good. I mean, I think it's very important to start dealing in adult level fictions. If you're going to have a state is going to have to do bad things or it's not, I think it becomes self-extinguishing.
Yes.
And I think that for some reason, it's time to tell the kids that the tooth fairy is actually mom and dad. And that's very terrifying to people, right? We don't have one man, one vote. We don't actually have a perfect system of, the 12 people can figure out who's guilty and who's innocent. There's so much that just doesn't actually work. But it does work better.
It works okay.
And it works okay. And if we could be a little bit less childish about extolling the virtues of the Enlightenment, I think we could advance the Enlightenment a great deal more. Because I think the embittering and invidious aspect of this is, when we wax rhapsodic about the Enlightenment, like, well, I've accumulated all of this wealth only by virtue of my ability to work the Enlightenment, and somebody else says, well, you did take our resources. That is an extremely angering thing, and I think, if you watch the Jordanian pilot ISIS video, which I recommend that you do not do, but some of us have.
That when they burn him alive?
Yeah, well, their point, which nobody seemed to register in the West, is you kill people in this exact way, through rubble when you destroy a building and through fire when your incendiary devices go off. And the entire point of this is we are simply going to do to you what you have done to us so that you will experience something.
Which has a theological backing as well.
Yeah. And
also in the Old Testament.
Right, and so it's this thing that happens. You get to this fork in the road, which is, are we going to do the plus stuff, the Enlightenment plus stuff back to you? Or are we going to take a higher road and create something where we will be elevated above our oppressors? And I think that, the Islamic impulse too often has been, we're going to do the bad stuff right back and worse. And it would be more positive if people saw that you could work the Enlightenment to create new wealth, new possibilities. And I'm concerned that when you asked about the science, there is an extent to which the great scientific discoveries have slowed. Like the 20th century was pretty horrible in terms of war and conflict, but it was absolutely astounding in terms of scientific change and understanding. And it has not kept that pace in recent years, and I think it's unlikely to keep that pace in most fields. And so we have to understand that it's going to be harder to create new wealths for some reasons I can go into, I don't want to right now, and it's going to be harder to get that kind of golden era. So there is a fear that you've missed out on the golden age of the Enlightenment, and now you're just carrying the super heavy backpack around, and you're not quite sure whether you're going to get enough out of it to make it worthwhile and allow you to catch up.
I mean, there's this other alternative that lingers in the background on all of this, which is that Enlightenment plus, Enlightenment as it is, it's all a bit passé, and there's a lot of people who say all of the things you just highlighted and more, inequality and so on, and who say, I've got another system. I've got another system of my own. That's what a lot of the people you cite, you say, why these weird cohabitations that occur? Well, that's easy. I mean, some people are perfectly happy to ride a stronger horse because they think it's going to get them to their destination. Now,
what stronger horses are you alluding to?
Well, for instance, I mean, we've had this for years in Europe. Look, by the late 1990s, the radical left, for instance, was stuck to a few people meeting in an upstairs room of a pub with a dog. And then suddenly they discovered, after the Second Intifada and after 9/11, that they were speaking to crowds of hundreds of thousands of people on occasions. That would propel you to think you might be onto something. So those people think they're riding the Islam bit. I would say that it's the other way around in that equation. But it's the sort of deal that gets done at this situation because people say, look, your society is unequal, you're not as loyal as you claim to be to your values, and your society is unfair. And of course the question you have to say or ask back is compared to what? What are your alternatives? And every single alternative that's come up with on this is so radically worse that you can't allow it to pass for a moment. I just throw one other one into the mix at this early stage. The intersectional answer, which is one of the more coherent, albeit, I mean, that's a damning statement in itself, of the theories that have been come up with in recent years. And this one, of course, says your society is unequal, and as a result, we have found this stratospheric version of justice, which if we can only operate it in the correct way, with the correct minority identity groups coming at the right speed and in the right location, we'll do that with our society and make it whole and pure and happy. And they seem not to realize that it's like coming in at that angle and it's just going to cause the most almighty pain and far, far more unhappiness than the system they claim to be critiquing. But that's just another of the ones that's coming in. It's because this inability to say compared to what.
It's interesting that you said that you used the word alternatives quite a lot. What's the alternative? Well, I mean, Angela Merkel literally said that there's no alternative for Germans to vote for. And what's the far-right party in Germany called?
Alternative for Deutschland.
Alternative for Deutschland. So when people are robbed of a sense that there is any alternative other than a moribund status quo, you get some nasty things emerging as that alternative. But let's follow up on that last point. And Sam, maybe you have some thoughts here, because I know that you're such a fan of identity politics. That's essentially what Douglas is talking about in terms of intersectionality.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking about a story I heard. It's not on the identity politics point, but there's a story recently that I heard. I'm sure it was reported widely somewhere, but I just saw it in a series of tweets from the New York Times journalist Rukmini Callimachi, who's the New York Times.
She's doing great work.
She's great. Most of what you might have read about ISIS, at least in the Times, has been covered by her. And she tweeted about this pair of cyclists, I forget where they came from, who were run over in, I think it was Tajikistan?
Tajikistan, yeah.
By someone who consciously had pledged affiliation to ISIS, and just saw in Tajikistan the way to run over an infidel is to see someone who's obviously a foreigner. And so apparently he had seen this couple riding their bicycles, clearly from some other country, and ran them over as an act of jihad. But what made this so poignant, and I think it encapsulates so much of what we're talking about here, is perhaps the most perfectly idealistic young couple on earth. They were riding all over the globe as a conscious evocation of the philosophy that we just live in one world, and they're just good people everywhere, and if you just put yourself out there, you will find that people of every culture and every race and every background and every religion will want to host you and feed you, and they encountered a lot of that, perhaps almost all of that, until they didn't, right up to the moment they were run over by jihadists. And so you had the coincidence of the youthful Enlightenment idealism, we live in one world where all well-intentioned people of whatever background will find a way to have their values converge. And it's a safe world, and it's a world where you can, with confidence, just go out and not live in fear of difference, right? And all the while, they are putting themselves in a circumstance that's tailor-made to have their idealism shattered by, most horribly, not human evil, but bad ideas that are indistinguishable from the worst of human evil, right? I mean, I don't,
I'd go so far as to call it human idealism, because many an evil has been committed in the name of idealism.
Yeah, it's a pathological form of idealism in this case. And, it comes full circle when you imagine, I didn't actually see this, but I'm sure this exists, when you imagine that someone somewhere on the intersectional left is looking at this story and thinking, well, this white couple in their white privilege thought the world was just their playground where they could ride their bicycles. And don't they understand that that they don't deserve such a world because they screwed it up, and everyone like them screwed it up with the mere prosecution of power. And that's the whole story here. But
Yeah.
I mean, we need to find ourselves in a world, we need to find a path to a world that justifies the idealism of that couple, right? I mean, we need a world where just as you can confidently ride your bike around Sydney, you should be able to ride your bike anywhere. And
It depends how WestConnex is going, but
but I mean that's the, you know,
So I think
that's the failure that
it begins with we in Western societies can make certain intellectual stands that may not necessarily address this, right? But they are the beginnings of this fight back. So Douglas referenced burqa, the burqa being a huge debate in the UK in August 2018, because it's true. The former Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, tweeted that women who cover their entire bodies in a black garment known as the jilbab and the face veil known as a niqab, often colloquially referred to as a burqa, though the burqa is a Taliban version where the entire face is covered with a mesh. Boris Johnson, the former Foreign Secretary in the UK, said, this looks like a letterbox, which the Americans refer to as a mailbox, you know, where you put your letter in the slip. And he was mocking this costume, and rightly so. And I was going to say, our defense of the Enlightenment values begins with making certain intellectual stands where I think the world is gaslighting us. In what kind of world is it okay to defend a uniform that is a symbol of medieval patriarchal tyranny over women, that victim blames women for their beauty and places the responsibility on the woman for her sexual attractiveness to a heterosexual or even homosexual woman, right? Or a heterosexual man who finds her beauty attractive. Beyond that, worse than that, is the liberal defense of this costume as some form of female emancipation and the right to choose. I don't support for the banning of the niqab, but what I cannot countenance, while I defend the legal right for people to be idiots, what I cannot countenance is people in the name of the political philosophy that I subscribe to, defending this as some form of female emancipation and liberation.
But it always comes out in the same way, doesn't it? Which is the question, well, who are you to say?
Right. So
and there have to be
because
more
I'm not a
people who
woman,
say,
right?
yeah, and there have to be more people who say,
well, because
I'll
I'm not a woman.
explain.
Right. Well, I'm not a woman, and I've had Muslim women who wear this garment say to me, "You're a man. Stop telling us what to wear," co-opting feminist Enlightenment arguments in defense of what is a medieval fundamentalist practice. And I say to them, and this is where we've got to be a bit bolder in our ability intellectually to respond to this bullshit. Because I say to them, hold on, you're telling me as a man, I can't comment on how I find this uniform of medieval patriarchal tyranny as oppressive. Remind me, who prescribed this? Weren't all the prophets men who told you what to wear? And you're saying, I can't comment on it? Every single prophet, every single interpreter or exegete of the Quran, every single jurist, and every single mosque imam in the UK, by the way, without exception, is a man in mosques that remain gender segregated till this day. And you choose to complain that I'm saying that this is wrong because I'm a man.
They'll grab absolutely anything on that one. I had this discussion in a mosque full of niqabi wearing, burqa wearing women who, I remember at one point they were like, it's our right under the European Convention on Human Rights, blah, blah, blah. And I had to say, it's patently absurd that somebody dressed for an 8th century desert should be telling me about the European Convention on Human Rights and
there we are.
Using it to claim that's why they're dressed the way they are.
Absolutely. And so when I say we make intellectual stands, I'm not saying it should be banned. I don't believe in the French model. What I am saying is this. If any of you, Douglas is the only non-Jewish, non-Muslim white male here, though he's not straight, so he also doesn't really count in the intersection.
It's the oppression Olympics, folks.
Yeah.
Actually, you're also not.
I'm a
not
gay
but you're
Jew.
also not straight too, right?
By the way, have you heard that there was a case at Wellesley recently of a woman who transitioned from female to male and applied for the role of head of the diversity committee, thought it was an absolute shoo-in, and didn't get it because actually she now benefits from white male privilege. She went all the way around.
But imagine there.
What?
Imagine
That's a
there
lot
was
of investment there as well.
Imagine there was a straight white male on this panel, and he came here this evening wearing a Confederate flag on his person, right? The flag of the South that lost in the Civil War. A Confederate flag, which many people find offensive. And in the American context, many liberals find that offensive because they see that it symbolizes a defense of slavery. Now, what they're not arguing, the liberals who find that offensive, they're not arguing for that T-shirt to be banned. What they're saying is, you're a plonker for wearing it, to reference Only Fools and Horses. And so that's my point, that you don't have to support the banning on this medieval monstrosity of a costume known as the niqab, to be able to criticize it.
But this is all evidence of everyone going mad.
Yeah.
Well,
So it is.
oh, go ahead.
Which Eric is a world
So these are the intellectual stands I think we need to make that
The
eventually end
analysis
up with
thereof.
your cyclists. And
Brett, you were
it
trying to-
begins there.
Yeah, Eric, you go first, then Brett.
Want to take it?
All right. Well, I
Brotherly love.
want to just clean up two things that I think will help. One, I want to challenge you on your point about Enlightenment Plus, because
Right.
I know what you're saying, but I think it's going to confuse things, because
Oh, sibling rivalry.
always. So just as it is true, when you think about science, right, when we say, what is science, right, you probably have some notion about journals and lab coats and laboratories and universities and all of that. That's not what science is. That's what science often looks like. But science is stuff that proceeds from the scientific method, and you don't have to be degreed in order to deploy the method, and you can be fully degreed and not deploy the method. And the real question is, it's science at the point you employ the method. Enlightenment values are not those values held by descendants of those who engaged in the Enlightenment. Enlightenment values are those values abstracted. And it comes down to two things. One of them is on the scientific front. And the point is, these things empower anybody who has access to them. So you don't have to be granted access to the Enlightenment by somebody who's descended from a population that wielded it. You can just study it and do it, and it does make you more powerful. So that's one part. And then there's the tougher part, which are the values that go along with it, which are not scientific and can't be objectively defended, but once we have established certain parameters, do end up superior. So in other words, in order to have the freedom to engage in investigating how the universe works, you need to imagine that liberty holds a certain priority over other things, right? Like obedience, right? Galileo was not obedient, right? So the point is, those things need to be separated, and to the extent that populations that descend from Enlightenment populations of Europe have engaged in bad stuff, well, they weren't employing the Enlightenment as they were doing it, so let's not tarnish the Enlightenment with it. The Enlightenment is the stuff of, it's the mechanism, it's not the people.
George Bush did, and Tony Blair did, though, didn't they? Because they did it in the name of freedom and democracy, which doesn't tarnish the idea.
They said they did, but they didn't actually.
Yeah, but that's a bit like, jihadis say they're doing it in the name of Islam, but everyone still hears Islam, and so there's a point at which that becomes irrelevant to the listener. If you're in Iraq and you're bombed in the name of freedom and democracy, the point, I get your point, but it becomes irrelevant to the people being bombed.
Well, I just want to establish up front, I'm not taking responsibility for the bad behavior of any population. I don't want responsibility for that. I am willing to take responsibility for the Enlightenment as a set of mechanisms and values which I believe are superior, and if you believe that there's something better, I'd like to hear about it, and then we can compare them. But I don't want responsibility for people, because people are going to screw it up, right? It's the stuff, it's the mechanisms that are really superior.
Also, Sam, weren't you trying to get at the kind of point that the charge of hypocrisy, that we are not perfectly consistent in the way that we apply Enlightenment values, and the charge of foreign policy being evil, don't really get to the nub of the question of whether or not a person ought to want to live in an Enlightenment society in principle? Like, you could have a totally hypocritical country, let's call this fictitious country the United States of America, which has a foreign policy totally inconsistent and corrupt, inconsistent with the values of its founding fathers. And yet you could nonetheless think, I want to live in a country where the constitution reads like that one does, and have the freedoms that country affords to its own citizens. So the question now is not, why are there jihadists outside of the United States who think that we're full of shit? It's why the people inside the United States, born and raised in the United States, who aren't Muslim at all, who don't want to live, seemingly, in a society or a culture founded on Enlightenment values.
Yeah, well, there are a few points of possible confusion here. I mean, one is I would say that, yes, there is hypocrisy. There are things that we have done at the level of foreign policy which are clearly not in line with our values. They're not an expression of Enlightenment values. But there's a gray area, too, because I mean, how different would the war in Iraq have looked had our only goal been to turn that place into a democratic paradise and unseat a dictator? I mean, or to make it an easier case, let's say the conflict with North Korea becomes truly intolerable. We have to intervene. There is no surgical way of doing it. Lots of people are going to die, right? Even if our only goal is to rip the bouffant-haired maniac who's running that cult out of power.
You're talking about Trump.
Yeah, yes. And restore some semblance of Enlightenment-based normalcy, 21st century normalcy to that society, that would still be a bloody mess to try to do that, even if it was a direct expression of Enlightenment values. Yeah. And it's our own Enlightenment values that causes us to worry enough over the collateral damage that we would only do that in an emergency. Yeah. But it is an emergency every day in North Korea, and arguably we don't care enough about that. Yeah. But I would say, I mean, most people on the extreme left, who we've been complaining about, clearly keep two sets of books ethically, where they have an incredibly fine-grained concern over moral infraction in this intersectional space. You have perpetrated a microaggression if you, I mean, the example I heard.
If you clap.
I haven't heard that example, but the example.
Jazz hands is what they would click. Jazz hands instead of clapping.
Oh, jazz hands, that's an appropriation?
Or clicking, yeah, because it can disturb some people that have trauma.
Oh. Well,
all of which disturbs
you are all culpable.
Do have trauma, which is
no. The worst one I heard recently was, which I think I just mentioned on my podcast. A friend who works at a big tech company has a black woman colleague who evidently is just looks fantastic. She's got awesome hair, which she constantly changes. I mean, she's putting it in pigtails and she's making it. She's just got awesome hair. But she considers any compliment on her hair from a white person to be a racist microaggression, right? So that is just, a symptom of mental illness, if there ever was one, to be living in that world. But I mean, it's just a needlessly horrible world that I'm going to decline to live in, right? And if I wanted to compliment her hair, it would not be an expression of racism on my part to do so, whatever she thinks. But so you have people like that who are concerned about our failures to navigate the most superficial differences in expectations of how people should be treated, but are quite sanguine about the prospect of men in Afghanistan forcing women and girls to live in burqas. And if you criticize that in their presence, they'll say, who are we to say that women and girls shouldn't live in cloth bags? And that's it's that double standard. It's easy to show the ridiculousness of that in conversations like this, but we have many people in our societies who will live their whole lives without seeing the ethical contradiction there.
Well, I think that one part of this that we just have to get past is we have to stop taking the intersectional left particularly intellectually seriously, because I think it's sort of like a
yeah.
I mean, there's a
Maajid's doing jazz hands.
What it is it's a cognitive denial of service attack, right? So we sit here and we you can tell the computer scientist.
I'm still trying to work it out. Yeah, I know what a
just go with it. It's all going to be good. So very often when you're in a different culture, you can't figure out what's a microaggression and what is a macroaggression. So let me try an experiment. The real reason I came to Australia is the following. Wait. Is this Australia?
No.
Try it again. Am I ever going to see your face again?
What was that? Can you explain that? I have no idea what you just
happened?
did.
Well, try it. Come with me, Mitchell.
All right. Okay. Here we go.
All right, just follow me here.
Yep. All right, that's better. Yeah.
You're going to say, am I ever going to see your face again? Try it. Am I ever going to see your face again?
What was that?
I don't know.
What did they say?
We don't have this tradition in London.
Did they just tell us to fuck off?
What?
Did they just tell us to fuck off?
The entire
Apparently,
auditorium
so
just told Maajid to...
What we are doing
to
is
fuck
we're
off.
exploring the difference because you're bewildered, right?
Yeah, it's that's strange.
I paid every one of them $5 for this. What's going on is we can't easily interpret different cultures. We don't know. We don't know what's a microaggression, what's a macroaggression. We're not being honest here a little bit. Like the issue of whether intolerance of intolerance is tolerance or whether intolerance of intolerance is intolerance
That's
is
very
mathematically
Rumsfeldian.
handled by is it a supersymmetry or is it an ideal in ring theory? Now, very few of you have PhDs in mathematics, but mathematics can accommodate both concepts. And in some cases, intolerance of intolerance is absolutely necessary for tolerance. In some case, it's more of the same. But you can keep somebody busy for 3 weeks on this problem if they're not equipped intellectually to deal with it. And I think we do need some half measures. We need some recursion limits. We need to be able to say, look, are we seriously talking about people in head-to-toe coverings where we can't see their face, the faces, and we don't know who's being oppressed and who isn't? I mean, there is some aspect of this of just for fuck's sake, right? I can't necessarily go all the way.
Some aspect.
But there are these contradictions that haven't been worked out, and Thomas Jefferson famously went to the Barbary Coast, I believe, when he found that our ships were being attacked. He said, we don't know you. Why are you attacking our ships? And these people said, well, we have this great book called the Quran, and it says that those are our ships, or we can do whatever we want. And he said, oh, can I have a copy? It's rather important. It's very difficult to interpret where we are. We're in a new space. There are certain combinations that don't work well together, right? You can brush your teeth or you can drink orange juice, but it's not good to do both because that doesn't feel right in the mouth. And I think it's important to understand that what we've done is we had this idea that it takes a long time to get Greeks and Italians and Irish to live together in harmony, but over a period of 50 or 60 years it can be done. Now we're in a longer digestion process. We're trying to understand each other. Everything is very confusing, and we just haven't budgeted enough. We have these incredibly simplistic concepts, and they're driving us insane because we don't actually understand the phenomena. The only reason I was able to pull that stunt is I happen to know this one weird fact about the Australian mimetic complex, right? But it's otherwise...
You've got to explain this to Maajid, because...
Some other time, right? But the effect
As
is
long as they understand what happened.
Well, it worked. Whatever you did, they told us to fuck off. I mean, this is great.
You could have said anything.
Hey, guys, I'm used to that. I win money when people tell me to fuck off. And $3.4 million of it. So,
Douglas, you have...
Well, just one thing, because on all of this, I entirely agree, but by the way, there's one on this which is obviously driving people even madder, which is everything to do with the identification of mental illness. Which, like, nobody knows where to draw a line, but if somebody says they have PTSD, there are people who have PTSD, and there should be some way of working out like people who are insincerely claiming it, because they are very offensive to people who actually have PTSD. Just like people who think that being bipolar is quite fashionable and they'd like a bit of it because it'll explain their bad behavior on occasions, are being very disrespectful to people who actually are bipolar. And we don't know how to deal with this. And I mean, like, the British government now says that mental illness has to be given parity with physical illness. So somebody claiming they've got PTSD who doesn't should be treated in the same way as somebody who has got cancer and needs treatment. We can't operate like this. So, but I'm always trying to find shortcuts in the way you suggest to deal with these people. I mean, one of them is to work out insincere claims and get them aside straight away.
Right.
And I mean, there was one example that I can think of, a colleague at The Spectator in London called Melanie McDonough, who's a Catholic and who holds the conventional views of the Catholic Church on abortion, was invited to a UK campus some time ago to engage in a panel discussion where she was going to be countered and so on, but a group of students came and sat on the front of the stage and chanted various insulting things, and they said, we're not safe, and and so on. And Melanie McDonough had the great wit and wisdom to get up and walk to these students and say, "Excuse me, but you're making me feel unsafe." And she said, so there we were in a standoff between two groups with equally insincere claims. Now that's one way.
Well, wait,
we've got to find others.
We have two problems, and again, we have to disentangle them. The disingenuous claims are a very serious problem. We've set up, in the left, we have a set of rules that basically takes any bad actor and promotes them to the top, right? There are rules that a bad actor can take advantage of to rise. We have to deal with that straight away. But if you deal with that, you're left with something else which is much more difficult, which is very badly phrased, very crudely reasoned arguments that actually could be resurrected to something smart. In other words, you have a lot of frustration that the system is in fact rigged against certain populations, which it is. Now, when asked in what way is it rigged against those populations, what you get back is garbage, right? It's not a proper description of what's taking place. There's white supremacy everywhere, as if people are burning crosses on other people's lawns, which isn't taking place. What is more difficult to say is that we have a system in which the geography in which you are born was built to disadvantage certain populations. So a history of redlining in the granting of loans in buying real estate persists to this day, even though nobody is redlining at this point. So the fact that you have inherited a zip code, and that zip code has inherited disadvantages, and those disadvantages are conveyed to you in everything from a higher probability of there being lead in your water to a completely crappy public school, which can't get better because we happen to collect tax revenues locally and then apply them to the school locally, so bad schools tend to stay bad rather than get fixed. All of these things do disadvantage certain populations in a way they can't escape or can't easily escape. And so there is a kind of deafness because the quality of the arguments is so low. There is a deafness to the claim that actually something very unfair is coming at us. And I do think it is our obligation to figure out what part of this is disingenuous, and that tends to be a small number of people who have a very disproportionately large effect on the conversation, and what part of this is actual legitimate frustration that just isn't well enough phrased for us to recognize it.
Can I comment on that? Because sorry, was someone trying to?
Well, I was going to, let me just quickly jump in there.
Yeah.
There's this thing I've been terrified to start talking about, but I have reluctantly begun this process, which is what I call the Great Oppression Shortage of 2018. And this has to do with a dream of the left in a previous era, which is we had very clear ideas about which ways we were screwing people over. And if we could just get rid of those ways, man, everything was going to be awesome. And we got rid of a ton of that stuff, and we got some improvement, but it was modest. And so now we're really disturbed because we can't, there's more to do, and I appreciate, Bret, what you're saying. I don't know that redlining has completely stopped, but it's certainly much better than it was. And so the feeling is that hey, things are much better than they've ever been to some of us. But to the people who invested in this idea that if we could get rid of the cultural bias in the IQ test, where the question is, Biffy and Muffy have to figure out how many finger sandwiches to serve at the country club, and suddenly you find that people who don't belong to country clubs don't do as well on that problem. Okay, when you get rid of that, you don't know what's going to happen, and you don't know if you're going to get rid of certain sort of structural issues at work. Are you going to eliminate the supposed wage gap? And then you have two departments that study the same object. You have the gender studies department and the econ department. And the econ department says, well, if you adjust for what majors people take and how many hours they put in and what kind of careers they pursue and whether they do kin work, there is no major wage gap. And the other one says, no, it's 25 cents on the dollar and it has to be eliminated now. And you don't have any playing field in which these groups can come together, because what we are dealing with, if we're honest, is that there was a dream, and the dream didn't happen. That we would find major sources of oppression, we would remove them, and very quickly everything would come to some beautiful new equilibrium. And so now what we have is we have small sources of structural oppression, and they are real and they're still there, but they're not sufficient to explain the lack of equality, if you will. And I think that this is terrifying to many of us.
If I can attempt to combine those two remarks, so to steelman your point, because there is something to that, others would refer to it as institutional racism and institutional discrimination.
Yeah.
Structural. There is something to that, and that is that if we can all conceive of how easy it is for institutions to develop an orthodoxy and then blindly defend that orthodoxy without realizing that they are prejudicing people that perhaps have a better idea, we know that's happened to us in the media. There's an orthodoxy that would cast everybody here as alt-right and incel male, which is flagrantly not true. I mean, how many people here are alt-right, to coin Eric's question from earlier? How many people here are alt-right? Just let off a whoop.
Just shout out.
If you are, just say, woo!
So half of you.
Do you want to ask the other question? How many people here are left of center?
Yeah. Yeah, me included. Right, so now, point being, there are institutional orthodoxies that become hegemonies, right? So the media is an example of where that's happened. And so I take your point that with race, with gender, there is that danger. So Douglas, right, and Josh, if you were to try and join the Catholic Church, you would be up against a hierarchy that historically and in contemporary times isn't as friendly to your sexuality, and therefore may, without realizing it, if you were a believer in Catholicism, probably would make it difficult for you to ascend the ranks.
If you wanted to be in the priesthood, for sure.
Yeah, so
Not in the congregation.
Indeed, in the priesthood, right? So,
or just take communion.
Now, I have multiple experiences of that with my interaction with the police forces. So probably on this stage, there are a number of things that have only happened to me. Being jailed in Egypt would be one of them, but growing up in the UK, being arrested at gunpoint was one of them, and I was racially profiled and had guns put to my head and arrested for suspicion of armed robbery when I was 15 years old. And because my 16-year-old brother in the summertime in the park was playing with a BB gun, a pellet gun, in the days that terrorism was associated with the IRA and not with Muslims, because this was 1989 or whatever, it was 1990. So that stuff happens, and that's me steelmanning your case. But I think what's so important and what we often forget when we talk about that stuff, and I've lived that stuff and I've suffered it, right? I might actually have PTSD. But what's important there is perspective. And often, this is now to your point, Eric, that often I think we forget, we lose perspective. I can guarantee you, having been in the prisons of Egypt, having lived in Pakistan, having traveled the Arab world and generally the greater Middle East, and knowing Muslim communities being of them and from them, I can guarantee you that there's a reason everybody is risking their lives on those boats to either die on the way to get to Australia illegally or to get to Europe or the United States of America. There's a reason, because in their heart of hearts, they know one thing, one truth, and that is that no matter how bad it is with the critiques, the valid critiques we have about structural racism, about what we say in the UK, institutional racism, no matter how bad it is, it's still better than what they are living in their societies. And they know that, which is why they are prepared to die to get to European
and why the movement
societies.
is in one direction.
I'm not disagreeing with that.
No, I know you're not. I'm saying combining your 2 points. I'm not saying in any way that you're disputing what I'm saying. I'm just trying to create the debate around this. So I'm saying perspective is the way to actually remember that and remember that's what the left forgets.
So there are
Douglas, just hold that thought. We're going to take some questions in a moment. So if you do have questions, you can start to make your way up to the microphones. Douglas.
very quickly. I mean, three things that come up. One, I mean, this issue. I don't deny at all, Maajid, right? But I mean, I was stopped and searched a few times as a young man. I just thought it was just a bit shitty.
You might have been deported from one or two countries.
Well,
more than
well. But the question of what grievances are playing into obviously exists, but that has to be one account. Secondly, I mean, Bret raises this issue of one of the things that's going wrong at the moment is the whole issue of the people raising important questions are raising them with the worst possible answers. I come back to this. Inequality is such an obvious one. The people speaking about inequality, generally speaking, have the worst possible answers to the problem. And so what happens? Their counterparts on the other side pretend it isn't an issue or just decide not to address it because the only people addressing it have such a horrific answer. And that comes back to the point Eric raises about the new hells we can be inventing. I mean, what are HR departments growing for everywhere? Because they think they've got some way to sort of solve these problems. I don't know if this is the case in Australia, but let me give an example of something. Most people who work in companies, I know in private companies in the UK and elsewhere across Europe are having, they all had quite rightly a drive to increase ethnic minority participation in companies like in politics. What do you get? You get a lot of black old Etonians rising very fast. Okay? A lot of very privileged people who have had all the sort of luck, but happen to fit that bit, rise fast. And then you promote, I know you want to get your female quotas up, so you promote people very fast. Then you discover things like, well, those people have also been lucky on a whole set of other metrics. What have you now failed to do in the meantime? Social mobility, horribly low, worse than it's been for decades. So how are you going to solve that one at the same time if you've been promoting so many very lucky, socially mobile people from other minorities? Now, the HR departments don't have any answer to this. They've just decided to leave class till last. But this all creates new problems. I'm not saying they're not good aspirations.
The most undereducated population in the United Kingdom at the moment is the white working classes, and also the most underemployed. If you consider white working classes as a bracket worth categorizing.
We've got to wrap this up, but Sam, you might have some final thoughts because, you know, after 9/11, your book, The End of Faith, was this salvo that put its boot up everyone's bum about just the kind of the seriousness of the threat that we face in the bluntest possible language. And after all of these intervening years, I wonder whether or not you're optimistic or pessimistic generally about the project of the, well, I don't want to say Enlightenment values because that sounds a bit grandiose, but...
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about these issues, obviously, and I spend no time evaluating whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I mean, like, I can't... I talk and think about these things because they just seem objectively important and captivating and occasionally rub up against something of genuine intellectual interest. So it's, I mean, the perfect solution in terms of paying attention to these things is to find important ideas of great consequence that most people are getting wrong, or that you think most people are getting wrong, and that, you know, that Venn diagram exposes something really worth paying attention to. And, you know, one idea is this, you know, this idea that this postmodernist or multicultural idea that there are no right answers, really right answers to the most fundamental questions of human life. You know, what value system is worth having and maintaining. So, but I'm never doing any of this thinking about the odds of success. It's just an imperative to do it.
Put it this way, why don't you tell us your crystal ball and we'll figure out whether or not you're an optimist or a pessimist.
You did a meditation.
It's strange. I mean, I honestly don't, none of this is done with any real expectation about the future. It's like, I really don't, because I mean, I am...
So it's 2030. You reckon it's just a coin toss as to whether or not we are more liberal and democratic or less?
Well, I have a very strong sense that good ideas have an advantage in the long run over bad ones, right? I mean, it's almost a tautology, right? I mean, it is useful much of the time to have a better map of reality, and whether that's a moral map, just what are the arrangements that will allow for 7, 8, 9 billion strangers to collaborate peacefully and creatively with one another. There are bad solutions to that problem, and there are good ones or better ones. And I just think that there is an advantage to intellectual honesty, consistency, coherence. I mean, it is what scales. It is the thing that I can tell you, which may go against the grain of everything you want to believe, and you will find yourself helplessly agreeing with me if I have a better argument and better evidence, or if I can show you some internal inconsistency to your worldview. So I think there's no question people who are reasoning consistently and who are open to being corrected when they fail are on the right side of our intellectual history. But it is a hard-fought battle to maintain that. And I mean, the only tool we have ultimately are conversations of this sort that we have publicly and in private, and that we use to continually recalibrate our bullshit detectors when we're facing debates on any of these issues. And I mean, to some degree, I think Douglas's admonition is where I come out, is that I think we collectively have to lose patience more and more and faster with obviously bad arguments. And that's where we're in the process.
I'm optimistic, and very quickly I'll tell you why I'm optimistic, because there's a story I want to give of this man here, Douglas Murray.
Careful. Which one?
Which one? Right. So it's 2018. I first met this chap 10 years ago, roughly, in 2007.
Yeah.
Roughly 10 years ago or more.
Just got back to the UK, yeah.
Yeah, and I had announced my departure from Hizb ut-Tahrir, and back then when BBC Newsnight actually meant something on nightly TV news, when people actually watched it, I had a 15-minute thing where I told the nation why I left, and Douglas and I were in touch then, and it was before we founded Quilliam. My very first public speech for why I left the Islamist ideology, as well as the group I used to belong to, Hizb ut-Tahrir, was given in London in 2007. It's still on YouTube. It's called In and Out of Extremism. And I just want to thank this man, and it's why I am optimistic, because it's 2018 and he and I are sitting here together. But what nobody knows, and what I've never said before in public, even to Douglas, is that what it meant to me in 2007, for that very first speech I gave explaining why I had departed from Islamism, to an audience that was, if you remember, it was standing room only, and it was all Islamists who, because I had just come out of prison, had put me up as some great defender of Islamism, and one of those fallen soldiers who's returned home. So the room was packed full of what I can only describe today as fundamentalists and Islamists. And there in the middle of this crowd, as I say, standing room only, and sitting right there was Douglas Murray. It's funny, I point there, I see a Solidarity t-shirt. Look at that, nice one, sir. And he was sat there and he attended that talk, which I can only imagine for me would be like walking into the room full of racist BNP supporters. But he came nevertheless, and he sat there and he heard me speak, because I imagine, I don't put words in your mouth, but you probably wanted to hear me out and see whether I was genuine or not. Fast forward a couple of years, and we were on opposing ends of a panel. Islam is a religion of peace. It was the IQ squared debate where I first fought with Sam, and nearly came to blows, and he was my opponent. But here we are in Sydney in 2018, and I can honestly say, and I hope he doesn't vomit at this, but I consider him a friend, and I want to thank you, because you were there from the beginning, and you were saying things back then that most people would consider beyond the pale. So why I'm optimistic. Because the debate has shifted.
Thank you.
Right?
Thank you.
And it's shifting in a positive direction, as far as I'm concerned. It's shifting towards Enlightenment values. And there's a reason why, for example, everyone here, I can't see you all, but there's a reason why everyone's here.
Yeah, let's bring the lights up and allow all the everyone here to be part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, let's start down here.
Good evening. In this country, we have partially segregated courts for Indigenous people. We have a different welfare state for Indigenous people and everyone else in this country. We also have a federal public service which will give preferential treatment to people that are one-drop Indigenous. And we also have, I've forgotten my fourth point. We also have a habit of acknowledgement of country, which was done before you came on stage today by our host, where we pay deference to the patriarchal elders of an ancient society before we can commence a meeting in this country. How does this all fit with Enlightenment values? For the Americans on the panel who don't know, the Indigenous experience is roughly analogous to the Indigenous Native Americans, and for the British you did it, so I hope you already know.
Not me.
Can't just take the good bits.
That's all right.
Is there anyone in particular you want
It's like we
to
disavowed
direct
his
that to?
mushroom comment earlier. It's just not me.
Brett, you're the evolutionary biologist who looks at tribalism. Why don't you take that?
Sure. I should say the tradition of acknowledging a debt to Indigenous people has begun to spread in the U.S. And while ordinarily I might think that was a very positive thing, there's something about it that is menacing when it is done now. It's a kind of threat. And so I would love to see it legitimized, because I do think there's something to it. But I don't want to see it abused as a mechanism for in-grouping and out-grouping, which is what I fear. Now, Josh and I did have a little chat about it before we came on
This
stage.
has come up, and my position, just so that you understand what that was about, is that it has become so normalized now that it's a statement not to do it. If I was in the States, I wouldn't do it. I think I'm glad that it's become normalized. I'm glad that it is something that to not do it would be an aggressive way of telling Indigenous people to fuck off, I think.
So I would also say in the U.S. we have yet to have a proper reckoning with what happened to the Indigenous population and what the holdover of that is. I think the Indigenous population and the slave-derived populations both have very special claims with respect to systematic disadvantage over centuries. With respect to what we do to hybridize it with Enlightenment values, I think we have to navigate it as a live issue. We've got a real claim on a debt. We have an ability to understand that we cannot navigate all of the past debts. We would spend the rest of eternity trying to right those wrongs, and it won't work. And the best thing we have is to try to make the system fair going forward, which means we can never get rid of bad luck, but bad luck has to be randomly distributed. To the extent bad luck is randomly distributed, then we can actually say something about what the effect of people's capacities and things are. But until bad luck is randomly distributed, we really do have to err in the direction of taking seriously claims of structural oppression and what we do about them. But what I would say, the ultimate answer to your question, is that the only toolkit with which you can parse those claims is an Enlightenment toolkit. It has to do with rigorously and dispassionately applying logic and evidence to these questions and seeing what you come out with. And then, once you discover what you've got, you can say, well, what is the correct remedy in light of the values that we all share, attempting to liberate people, to provide them the opportunity to choose what sort of lives to live. Given those things as values, what is the best remedy here that does not create undue consequences? Something like that.
And if I could just throw one quick thing in, my approach to this is you either own the bad stuff that your group or your inherited group has done, along with your own achievements, you know, or don't do either. But what you cannot do is simply wallow in your own thievery, your own perfidy, your own general badness as some sort of orgiastic exercise in self-hatred. And so I think it's extremely important to recognize that bad things, terrible things, unimaginably horrible things have been done, and that is part of a lineage, but that it is a compound lineage, and you have to make an obligation to yourself that you are going to reckon with the positives and the negatives as a composite and not do one without the other.
And you can't do the reverse either, take pride in your own group's achievements.
Absolutely.
Without,
I think that they come as a couplet. And do you want to say if people should choose who they want to lead off?
Yeah, you mean who
questions?
Yeah. If you wouldn't mind directing your question to whoever you want to answer it.
The Moral Landscape, I really like that book. And I think my question's relevant as far as science pertains to Enlightenment values. But my question is for the Weinstein brothers. So, not to put you under the spotlight, Sam, but do you agree with Sam's book in terms of can we reason our way out of Hume's is-ought distinction, and can science solve normative claims?
I would just broaden that to science being rational thinking generally, not white lab-coated science.
Yeah. I'd be happy to take a crack at it. You want to start?
Let's try to do it super fast.
Yep.
Basically, the big issue with is-ought to me is that when you define human flourishing, you always have the possibility that the human species is different. It's not going to be like any other species. It can wake up and decide that anything constitutes human flourishing. And so there is some sort of Chomskyan pre-grammar of something like archetype or religion, in my opinion, that has to do with making sure that the brain doesn't start just focusing on its own pleasure. The idea that the purpose of life is to be happy is a very dangerous idea, and I disagree slightly with Sam in that he says that the best ideas should out, and the problem is that the fittest ideas will tend to outcompete the best ideas if the best is meaning the most rational and truthful. And sometimes you have an idea that is fit or an idea that is self-extinguishing. So you have to think about, is an ought having to do that morality comes ultimately from the ability to outcompete others, which seems very strange. We think of morality in different terms. But the big danger is that our bodies have to mediate a system of soma and germ, the part of us that goes on as lineage and the part of us that is expendable and will never recur. And in this system, you have proximate goals and ultimate goals. Ultimate goals have to do with preservation. Proximate goals have to do with like discomfort. So thirst for dehydration and hunger for lack of nutrition. And so the great danger is that the brain wakes up and starts taking care of its proximate goals and unhooks them from the ultimate goals. So I think that in general, is-ought, to me, comes out of an evolutionary theory of systems of selective pressures, and it tends to be a Chomskyan pre-grammar that keeps the brain from focusing on pleasure as an ultimate end and defining that to be human flourishing, which would be catastrophic for the preservation of the species.
Okay.
Bret, you could talk for 3 hours about the subject.
Very different answer, and I think relatively short. I actually disagree with Sam that you can ground the ought part of the equation in pure science and logic. You cannot even ground a claim that being alive is better than being dead. There's no defense for that claim. Now, it happens that everybody in this room will agree that being alive is better than being dead because of selection. In other words, those who didn't believe it didn't leave so many descendants, and those who did left descendants, and so you've all inherited that fiction. So, in any case, my point would be, you cannot establish these claims scientifically, but that's not a big deal, because we can actually agree on the values that make sense in light of our particular evolutionary delusions and proceed from there pretty easily. So I'm not worried about the fact that you can't ground it, but no, you can't.
Okay, well, just as a brief response, I think we're talking past each other a little bit, but you can't ground the axioms of science scientifically either.
Right.
You have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps in physics and in math and in logic
At
and
the
in morality.
very bottom, you have to
Yes.
have a little bit of faith, actually.
Yes. Well, it's just there's something that's axiomatic that it's fundamental enough to your thinking about in that domain that it need not be justified, and there's no place to stand that's more rudimentary from which you can doubt that proposition, right? And so my foundational moral proposition is the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, and that anything that is better than the worst possible misery for everyone is a place worth. A movement away from the worst possible misery for everyone is good.
Even though it's
Better.
not true, you
Yes.
can get all of us to agree to it.
I much admire what you smuggled in there, Bret.
Do you?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Did anyone notice that? Sly, your brother. Yeah.
Go for it.
Hi, I'm actually just looking for interesting and thought-provoking podcast recommendations from you guys.
Nice.
Hardcore history.
Waking up.
Yeah, other than Josh and Sam.
I'm going to launch one, actually, what most people don't know. I've recorded the first episode already. It happens to feature this man, and why his conversation with Ezra Klein went so wrong. But I will be putting out a regular podcast myself. The radio show isn't long form enough to explore stuff of interest.
Yeah. I would also just say, obviously, in addition to We the People Live and my other show, The People Versus, and Sam's podcast and Maajid's new podcast, I don't know if you've heard us talk about Very Bad Wizards, but
Yeah.
it's
they're
great. And I always try to give them those guys a shout out.
I would recommend The Weeds for trying to figure out exactly how the other side is misthinking so many things at the highest possible level. It seems to me to be the best exercise in bad thinking.
Thank you.
And the Slate Political Gabfest and the Slate Culture Gabfest I still enjoy. Yeah.
G'day. I'm going to go Sam or maybe Douglas. What do you think of a democracy where the general public get to vote for policy, somewhat like the Swiss system versus Parliament voting for our policies?
Well, even in Sam's home state of California, they have that, right? You
Well,
can
I
get
actually
anything
don't
like
know.
that.
I don't know enough about the Swiss system. I think democracy. There's been some interesting books that have come out recently challenging the notion of democracy in ways that, in the aftermath of Trump, seem all too
But just to
credible.
clarify, Sam, I think the question here is about direct democracy, right?
Oh.
So being able to get any referendum up on the ballot if it just has enough signatures. Here you can't do that. In California you can.
Yeah, well, I think as currently constituted, it's a problem. I mean, it winds up being distracting and just responsive to kind of whims and populist craziness that just gets a certain kind of energy, and then suddenly you have this thing that now has to be revoked at some point, and it's harder.
Sounds very much like Brexit.
Yeah. Well, Maajid and I are on different sides on this matter, but I just say quickly, I mean, the Swiss example, you can't copy anything in Switzerland. It's like there's this endless thing about Scandinavian countries. It's always like the Norwegian model, and the Swedish model, and it's always the Swiss model is the worst of all because it's a very unique and unusual country, and very, very locked in every manner. I mean, it's an incredibly heavily armed country that doesn't have very much gun crime. I mean, all sorts of things like that. In general, by the way, I wouldn't be too dismissive of some of it. Look, I think that the direct democracy thing, like the thing of the Brexit vote, has an opportunity to release public feeling on very important matters which elites don't want to address. And I don't think one should entirely sniff at those expressions. And one of the reasons I think we don't have a kind of far-right party in Britain is because our bubbling resentment over our membership of the European Union and what it became, which we hadn't signed up for, was released by going to the country and asking them to vote on this matter. And I think for all of the very distinct forms of torture we're going through on this, at least the public had a say. And look, the elite they're trying to not do what the public asked them, but they are taking the vote seriously. And I have friends from continental European countries who say to me, although they disagree with the vote, they admire the fact that the British people said something and the politicians are trying to do what the public asked. Because in a lot of European countries, when they went to them, the public voted and they were told, go back and vote again because you did the wrong answer. And that happened in Ireland, it happened in France, it happened in the Netherlands, the Lisbon Treaty. So, sometimes it can be helpful, yeah.
Douglas, the vote may be one reason why Britain doesn't have a far-right party, but the other might be that Britons are just almost in a Swiss kind of way, so uniquely cool with gradual and incremental change. Do you know the I guess it's a joke about the British protest march. What do we want? Mild and gradual change. When do we want it? At any moment that's convenient to you. Do you want to jump?
Hi there. This question can be for anybody. So it feels like with identity politics, in many ways, it's a shame game. So we're all afraid to say anything because somebody's going to tell us that we're homophobic, xenophobic, sexist, racist, whatever. But we know from psychology that shame is one of the least effective ways to actually get behavior change. So it feels like if we here in this room are trying to push forward a conversation, it's critical that we don't use shame in our toolkit of actually communicating. So I'm curious how you guys have, I guess, trained yourself to have constructive conversations without actually using shame and telling the other side that they're idiots.
Well, just one point of clarification. Shame is incredibly effective within group. It's just it's like within the tribe, shame is one of the most motivating things. It's just one coming from the other tribe.
And another addition to that, I think it's also very important. Of course, psychology is the science of understanding the individual on a societal level. It's also very important as a taboo. And so if something, as we know just from the word taboo, if something is the kind of behavior that encourages a backlash in society against an individual, they're less likely to do it. So the purpose of a shame in a macro sense, in making something a stigma, is very valuable. But when engaging in an individual one-on-one conversation, then I agree with you that from an out-group perspective, it's not the best way to encourage change. But so it depends on what we're seeking to achieve.
Okay, we can take 2 more questions. So sorry to the people who we won't be able to get to.
It's unfortunate. Thank you, everyone. I have questions for all of you, but as a card-carrying Jordan Peterson fanboy, naturally it's for Sam. One of the things you finished on was self-correcting. So I'm curious to know, have you done so after your conversations with Jordan Peterson?
I mean, have I seen the error of my ways and converted
obviously.
to Petersonian worldview? Well, you'll have to watch those videotapes when they come out.
Take your time, Sam.
Is that a no?
I mean, there's nothing about. I like Jordan a lot. I mean, the thing that changed is I spent a fair amount of face-to-face time with him, and all of that was good. I have no doubt that he sincerely wants to help people and is helping many people in certain ways. We still disagree about some fundamental things, and I think you'll see, if you're paying attention, the basis for my disagreement on stage. But it's the conversation continues. I mean, it's not over. I think he's addressing some real problems. I think you can address those same problems without obfuscating anything in a 21st century worldview. You don't have to import anything from the Iron Age to solve those problems.
So that is a no.
Yes, it's a diplomatic no.
Yeah. Go for it.
Thank you all for being here. Probably a question for Bret. In the case of the extreme left, authoritarian left ideas that are circulating within academia and in particular in the arts and humanities fields, is this coming from the top down, so from professors and lecturers? Is it taught as part of curriculum, and what can be done to counter these bad ideas being taught and basically infecting the young minds in academia?
It has multiple origins. One origin goes back several decades. So back in the 90s, we fought the first battle against postmodernism. And so there is an unclear relationship with postmodernism here, because most of the people on the authoritarian left, while behaving in a modern fashion, have never studied postmodernism. They don't know that that's what they're doing. But what you have is people who were students of postmodernism in the 90s, who have matured into professors wielding postmodernism in 2018. They are doing so inside of fields that were created, I hesitate to say it, but I think it's a fair label. These fields were created as a kind of intellectual affirmative action where critical race theory, women's studies, these fields were placed on a par with the hard sciences, for example. And that was basically the negotiated settlement of a disagreement about power, basically an earlier version of the disagreement about the fairness of having those who had come to the table with power continuing to wield that power. So others were granted power by being given these parallel fields. And what happened recently is that those fields have incited a kind of mind-numbing resistance and militance in a group of students who haven't yet encountered the world, haven't yet encountered the processes that would tell them that these ideas don't actually hold any water. So many of them are very earnest, but later in life they will discover that these ideas are not powerful. So anyway, you've got a professorial class inciting students who don't know any better to stage a mutiny. And I think it's time to recognize that creating phony fields was a mistake in the first place. That a field has to be able to deliver something of value that can be pointed to in order to justify the investment of resources in it, and that the educational system has to be brought back to its central purpose, which is creating highly capable minds, not coddling people's particular beliefs or making them feel a particular way about who they are or something like that. The purpose is to create cogent brains. So,
Douglas, do you want to jump in on that?
I agree with every word of that. I just wanted to say, I suppose, because it's the last question, sadly, and I just thought it was worth saying. Somebody raised the question of optimism and pessimism earlier, and I've always said, let's not get into a game where just being very optimistic means you win, because it doesn't make sense in the long run. And nobody ever mistook me for Prozac, but I have to say that in all of this, and it ties in with what Bret just finished with there, I'd just like to say, I suppose on behalf of all of us, but being rather presumptuous, just what a pleasure and how optimism causing it is for me and for us that you're all here and that we're having this discussion in Sydney, and many people have been here for many hours, and it's an extraordinary demonstration, I think, that something is changing, and that if it's not going to change within the academy and the universities, then it will change from outside. And you are, by being here, a demonstration of that, and a powerful force yourselves for this very change which so many people want to bring about. And I just wanted to give credit to you and to say thank you, because it is an extraordinary thing.
Please thank Travis Pangburn and Pangburn Philosophy for making today possible. And Eric Weinstein, Douglas Murray, Maajid Nawaz, Sam Harris, and Bret Weinstein. Thanks to all of you for coming. Cheers.